Welcome to Curious Coaching, the Sport Northern Ireland podcast for coaches who are driven to explore new ways, thirsty for new ideas, and passionately curious about how they can maximise the power of sport through great coaching. The podcast that seeks not to answer coaching questions, but to provoke them.
Hello and welcome to the Curious Coaching Podcast with myself, Michael Cook, and my colleague Simon Toole. This is our first time back in a while. Hopefully you were able to tune in to Series 1 of the Curious Coaching Podcast. This is Series 2. And to kick us off today, we have our special guest, Dr. Peter Olusoga and Derek O'Riordan. Guys, you're very welcome to be with us here this afternoon. The theme today on the podcast is going to be around coach wellbeing and some of the outcomes of coach wellbeing and when coaches are not experiencing wellbeing in relation to potential burnout. Really exciting theme, really looking forward to having the conversation with the guys. As a bit of a brief introduction, Pete is a senior lecturer at Sheffield Hallam in psychology, has a wealth of experience and a really strong background in sports psychology, and is host of his own podcast, 80% Mental, which I had a good listen to this morning. Derek is a coach developer, and again has a massive range of experience working with governing bodies in relation to coach development, and is a current PhD student who is studying what coaches think about. And I probably haven't done that justice, Derek, but you can let us know a little bit more about that if you're happy throughout the session. So guys, welcome. Pleased to have you here. If possible, kick us off with just telling us a little bit about your research interests and maybe a little bit about yourselves.
Okay, I guess I'll go first then. So my research is in stress and burnout in high-performance sports. My PhD was in stress and coping, how coaches cope with all of the stress and the different demands that they experience in high-performance sport environments. And then since then, I've explored, like I say, a little bit more about burnout, a little bit more about well-being and how we can encourage coaches to look at well-being as a bit of a performance strategy for themselves and just take care of themselves a little bit.
Fantastic and very topical to what we're going to talk about today. Derek, over to you. Let's hear a bit about you.
So I'm a coach developer and coaching systems builder with experience of developing coach education frameworks and programs for coaches. Less experienced in the research field than perhaps Pete is, but my research that I'd done as part of my postgraduate journey was really around stress and coping and world-class coaches, but equally what coach developers can do to manage and mediate and support coaches through stress and burnout experiences.
Fantastic, and we're definitely going to get into some of that today in the conversation. I'd just like to kick off. We've obviously done a bit of prep and around the topic before we came here today. You shared a sentence, and I'm going to read this back to you, and that might be a really good place to start. As an overarching theme, what if experiencing stress, anxiety, and or burnout as coaches is perfectly a reasonable response to the environment we find ourselves in? Tell us more about that.
Yeah, I guess the reason why we perhaps frame that question is quite often we put the onus or blame the coach at times around feeling stressed or being stressed within the environment. We think that there's something wrong with the coach. But I'm firmly of the view when we consider the social environmental factors that go into the stress experience or the burnout experience, that quite often the system is the patient in need of care and not necessarily the coach themselves.
Okay. And to add on that one, Pete?
Yeah, I think we the way that we frame coach interventions and the way that we frame burnout and well-being, like with coaching populations and kind of in more general sense as well, is that it's the individual who's responsible for their own self-care. So if they're not managing with something, if they're not able to cope with stress, well, it's down to them and the way that they are managing it, their coping strategies. We need to upskill them in how they manage their emotions and take care of the environment and so on to promote their own well-being. Whereas, exactly like Derek says, it's much more of an organizational issue. We think about stress and burnout as a response to an environment that is unsustainable, really, in terms of workload, in terms of the pressures that are involved in the job. So, yeah, looking at it from much more of a systems perspective, like what can the organization do in order to help coaches with their well-being. Because I think, if you look at high performance sport in particular, it is abnormal in the amount of stress and pressure that is placed upon coaches and other types of performers. It isn't ordinary. So yeah, stress is a perfectly reasonable response to being in that environment, and we shouldn't really shy away from that.
No, and just to build on that, I think we might talk a lot about performance and pathway environments in the context of this podcast, but coaches who operate within the grassroots game aren't immune to these stresses. Either they might be under or experiencing different demands, but the stress response is still going to be the same. And for a lot of people who are volunteering and coaching, it's just another plate to spin in what has become very busy lives for everybody in society, never mind, say, just in coaching alone. So yeah, I think we need to be sensitive to that in the grassroots game as well. It's not just a problem that is in performance sport.
Yeah, I mean, we've spoken about this before, haven't we, Derek? But I mean, yes, the stress of elite sport, but we're coming off the back of a global pandemic that we've been involved in the last 3 years. There's an existential environmental catastrophe that we're all sort of worried about. There's a cost of living crisis, so we're trying to navigate our jobs with all of that stuff in the background as well. So, it just again highlights the fact that feeling a little bit of stress is a perfectly normal response to what we're all dealing with. And that's, before we've even gotten to the stress of the job role.
I think you've captured that really well. Why should we be talking about, why should we use a platform like this to be talking about coach well-being at this present minute in time?
Well, I think it's just such a huge issue that is kind of almost underappreciated. There's a couple of research papers come out in the last few years, which I'll point to. There's a study came out just last year, 2022, and some of the findings from that research were a little bit startling, I guess, because we all know that coach well-being is an issue. We all know that coaches tend to put self-care as kind of the least important part of their job role. But this research explored coaches' perceptions of well-being and the prevalence of mental health issues, really. It was Vita Pilkington, a 2022 study. And it found, the study found that 40% of coaches reported risky alcohol consumption as a result of the stress in the role. About 15 to 20% of them reported moderate to severe sleep disturbance. This is kind of like, if you start putting this in terms of actual numbers, this is almost half of coaches talking about risky alcohol consumption. 1 in 7 coaches talking about sleep disturbance, severe sleep disturbance. Again, 15%, around 1 in 7 or so, talking about high to very high levels of psychological distress. So, well-being in coaching, when we start to think about that in terms of actual real people and the impact that it has on their lives, it's such an important issue to consider.
Yeah, just to build on that slightly, in recent years, we've seen a lot of stories in social media and through news media around athletes coming out and talking about their well-being and the impact that performance environments have had on them. And we see very limited, very few stories of coaches coming out and doing the same, when we know through the research that these are the environments that they find themselves in. These are the symptoms that we're seeing. These are the coping mechanisms that they're reaching for in terms of excessive alcohol. But why isn't coach well-being more prevalent in the public discourse around some of the issues that we begin to discuss and continue to discuss in and around performance sport and sport in general? So it's probably important to bring it to the table and frame this conversation now, so we start to draw more attention towards what certainly I believe, and probably we believe, is a very important, prevalent issue in sport.
And, you mentioned that concept of athlete well-being being very much at the forefront of people's minds and in terms of sporting systems and the wider media. Is it fair to say that coach well-being just isn't? And, why not?
If I could jump in on that, a real simple term, athlete well-being is a reflection of coach well-being. And I think quite often some of the issues that we may find athletes are going through could be managed and mediated better by providing more holistic and system-wide support into the people who surround the athlete, including the coach. How many of these issues of well-being can be avoided if we just take a systems view of how we're supporting well-being and positive health across the system?
Yeah, I think, athlete well-being is such a priority because, well, I don't know, maybe it's to do with visibility. The athletes are the ones that are out there performing in front of crowds on television, whatever it might be. And there's a visibility there about their own well-being, whereas the coach is the one who's more often than not slightly removed from that. There's obviously exceptions to that, a kind of real high-performance sport where the coach is in the limelight a little bit, and that just adds to the pressure. But there's certainly something there around the visibility of the athlete and why athlete mental health is a priority. And, we're not saying that athlete mental health shouldn't be a priority. It absolutely should. But we should be thinking about, as Derek says, the system. Who else is involved in the system? Who's looking after the people who are looking after the people? So, yeah, there's a need, I think, to focus on coaches a lot more.
I know Simon had some questions around those challenges that the coaches are currently facing.
Yeah, I guess because we've been talking about coaches as a big group. I'm diving in a little bit at the really high performance end of sport about that what that looks like. I guess in Northern Ireland we've got lots of different individuals in lots of different contexts, working with lots of different participants, different athletes. We've got coaches who are paid, small number. We've got lots and lots and lots of coaches who are doing that on a voluntary basis. So what do you think are some of the challenges that are presented across that really diverse group of people who coach that are leading to different types of stress?
You've probably got more experience of that than I have.
Well, from a grassroots perspective, actually, there was an interesting piece of research. Things we're leaning into research a little bit here by North et al. I think it was in 2019, where they explored stressors in the context of grassroots sport. And coaches talk about having access to appropriate facilities, equipment, time on task with the athletes, their interactions with parents and parental demand on what they expect out of coaches. But equally within environments, they talk about interpersonal conflict between coaches, misalignment of values between the organisation or the club they represent and who that coach actually is and how those values align, whether that's around delivering results or developing people. So all of these sort of social factors coalesce around coaches and have a detrimental impact on their well-being. Pete, you might want to talk about some performance environments, some of the challenges there.
Yeah, I mean, there's huge amounts of challenges, and from anecdotal evidence and stories we hear from coaches, but from some of the research as well, there's the long hours, the isolation of the role, and that's kind of literally being isolated, spending time away from your family, away from home for long periods of time, but also that kind of metaphorical isolation, like feeling lonely in the role, feeling like you don't have those perhaps people that you can talk to about some of the pressures that you're facing. There's the massive role of job insecurity at the high end. Whether that's a case of being fired if you're not performing, or whether that's funding being withdrawn from your program because you haven't achieved results. So job insecurity and that kind of year-long job insecurity is a massive stressor at the high performance level. But I think one of the perhaps most pervasive challenges that coaches face is just a culture of high performance sport in itself. And it's a culture that is... It's this hyper masculine culture that's characterized by things like grit and strength and mental toughness and resilience and all of those words that you hear flying around all the time. And what that does is it doesn't leave any space for coaches being vulnerable and coaches talking about mental health or mental well-being issues. What they tend to do instead is hold up this kind of mask of stoicism and kind of mask of emotional control, where it's kind of like the proverbial duck on the water, isn't it? Where everything has to stay calm and smooth above the water, whereas below the water they're kind of like paddling away like crazy, just trying to stay afloat. So that the actual culture of sport itself, and this is like a if we go beyond sport for a minute, this is like a societal issue. We celebrate overwork. We wear like stress and burnout as like a badge of honor. Like, one of my colleagues the other day put something on one of the social media platforms saying, "Oh, look, I was in work at 7 o'clock in the morning and I didn't finish until 10 o'clock at night." I'm like, well, that's not impressive. Like, but we frame it in that way. So the culture of sport itself is one of the biggest challenges, I think, to coach stress and coach well-being.
Yeah, I'm just going to lead into something Pete said as well around the how we access sources of support and the people that we may want and need to talk to make sense of and to disclose perhaps how we're feeling and what we're going through. And certainly in the research that I've done more recently, I spoke to coaches about being away from home for a third of the year, so that they're away on competitions or training camps for 120 days a year. But when they go home and they feel like they need to let go of certain things, that they want to talk to their partner or their family, there's a degree of decompression, reintegration, resentment from the family for being away when they've got young kids at home. So we might make assumptions around the types of support that coaches have access to, not just within the system, but out with the system. But actually, the nature of high performance sport and the working practices, not just the culture, have a broader impact on coaches' ability to just be vulnerable and just to let go of what's going on for them right now. So what tends to happen, they bottle, and then eventually they bang. And I think the thing that we need to recognize that if we continue to mask, if we continue to hide, if we continue to hold in, that stress eventually finds its way out, whether that's through a physical manifestation, an emotional manifestation, it finds its way out somehow. So that, we need to support coaches to understand that, make sense of that, and develop resources, both within themselves, but around the system to be able to cope.
Brilliant. Thanks, guys. And I know Michael in a little while is going to maybe ask you some things that maybe we could start to think about, maybe as individuals, as people who operate within the system or the wider system. But stress itself, we suppose we've spoken about it a fair bit so far, but not maybe taking a dive into, well, what is it? And how does it manifest within coaching?
Okay. So I always like to describe stress. Stress is a process, first of all, rather than it being an outcome of something. And I always like to describe stress as like a balancing act. So if you imagine like a seesaw or like a set of weighing scales, for example, and on one side of those scales are all of the demands that you might face in your life. So some of them are going to come from the job, some of them are going to come from family, some of them are going to come from pressures that you put on yourself, but all of those demands sit on one side of the weighing scale. On the other side of the scale are, I don't know why I'm doing this because we're on a podcast, but on the other side of the scale are coping resources. So things that you can do to manage some of those stressors. So that might be social support, that might be some of the just skills that you have to stay relaxed under pressure, some ability to manage your own emotions, that sort of thing. Now, stress occurs when there is an imbalance between those two sides of the scale or the seesaw. So that can happen in a couple of ways. Firstly, the demands can start to pile up, and that will tip the seesaw. Or your coping resources might be diminished a little bit. So maybe that happens when you are fatigued, or maybe that happens when it's just a really stressful period in your life and you just don't really have the energy to do the things that you normally would to manage. So either of those two things can cause the scales to tip or the seesaw to tip. It can tip the other way though as well. So if you're in a period where you have loads and loads of coping resources and everything's going okay, and actually you don't have any demands at all, like that can be stressful as well. That's just boredom, which can be equally stressful. But stress is the process of weighing up those demands versus your ability to cope with them. Actually, more accurately, it's your perceptions of how well you think you can cope with them. But stress occurs when there's a bit of an imbalance there. So this is when you're talking about different types of coaches in different types of environments. Like the demands might be very different for certain types of coaches, like volunteer coaches, community coaches versus high performance stuff. The demands are different. but the actual process of stress occurring is exactly the same, and the result of that process can be exactly the same in the way that stress is felt. So that's how I normally describe stress.
Brilliant. That's a really useful analogy, definitely for me. I know I've spoken to Derek about this before, but that picture that's painting is brilliant. Derek, when we were talking about stress, you spoke about distress and eustress. Can you tell us a little bit about that and maybe how that fits to what Pete's just spoken about?
Yeah, I guess if we consider stress can affect people in two different ways, or what we might perceive to be stress can affect people in two different ways. Distress may be associated more with what Pete describes in terms of we don't necessarily have the resources to cope with the demands that we're dealing with, but equally some people, not just coaches, might actually become quite motivated by stressful situations, challenging situations, and we would describe that as eustress, right? So they get a motivational response, they get energy from being put in those situations, and actually it's quite motivational for them.
And that then, Pete, is that connecting back to that bit around the boredom factor then? Is that where eustress connects in?
Well, I mean, that can be distress as well, that boredom. I think, the important point here is that stress isn't actually necessarily a bad thing. It doesn't have to always be a bad thing. Like Derek said, some of the research suggests that coaches become much more motivated. I mean, anyone who's been at school and had an exam, a day before the exam, you suddenly get a little bit more motivated to study, right? So, it doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. And that's where that eustress comes in. It can be motivational, it can inspire, it can increase people's productivity, a little bit of stress. And I think what we have to separate when we're talking about coaching is an awareness of what are the normal stresses of the job, and an acknowledgement that, yes, this is a stressful profession. It just is. We can't get away from that. It's sport. And when that stress becomes too much, when that's tipping over that line into, well, actually, this is above and beyond what should be demanded of a human being here. And it's kind of finding that line and understanding where that line is. And again, that's going to be an individual thing. But until we start to develop a little bit of awareness of where that is, then we're going to constantly be struggling with stress.
And I suppose we've got different roles in sport, as in you've got the coach, and how can they become better at seeing that in themselves? Or we've got some people who are working alongside coaches to support them. How do they then see that? Or as a system, how do we start to see how that, or as line management or direction within coaching, or within a governing body, within clubs, how do we get better at seeing that early so that we can sort of try and intervene?
So, I mean, I can talk about it from the individual coach level, first of all. And, I mean, self-awareness is the first thing that's an important skill for coaches to develop. Coaches, by and large, are really good at reflection. They reflect on their coaching practice and what they do and take that into following sessions and how can I improve my coaching. So the actual act of reflection is something that coaches do naturally quite well, generally speaking. Derek's pulling a funny face at me now. But what they tend to do less well is that real deep level of self-reflection on their own internal processes. So how they manage stress, the stresses that they're experiencing, how their responses to stress might change over time. So that self-awareness skill, and it is a skill because it can be developed, is one of the ways that coaches can get better at recognizing stress before it tips over into burnout. How can you do that? Well, fundamental reflective questions that you can build into your coaching practice. What are the things that are stressing me out this week? What are the demands that I'm facing? How am I responding to those things? Have my responses to those things changed over the last week, 6 weeks, 6 months? What's the impact of the things that that are causing me stress? Am I taking that home? One of the questions that I get coaches to ask themselves quite a lot is, how would somebody else recognize that I am stressed? Because then that gets you to start thinking about other people's perspectives. Okay, what are the actual behaviors that I'm exhibiting here that signify that I'm stressed? Am I more irritable? Do I take it home with me? Do my family notice when I'm stressed? So really taking the time to build those types of reflective questions into your coaching practice is a really good way of developing that self-awareness skill, I guess, which is the first step towards understanding a little bit of your own stress responses.
Yeah, and look, the reason I was pulling a funny face is that, look, I think coaches are really good at recollecting, maybe not entirely good at reflecting on their practice, and what Pete's described as a strategy through which coaches might explore their thoughts and their recollections to use those as a catalyst for change. I think quite often coaches may recollect something and not necessarily use that as a means of behaviour change and how they might change things into the future, and that's probably why I pulled a little bit of a face. From an individualised perspective as well, if we think of this from a more of a social orientation, we might talk about supporting coaches to develop a sense of coherence. So their ability to make sense of chaotic and unstable environments that they might find themselves in, like high performance sport. And we could think about that with sort of three underpinning strands. Number one is comprehensibility. So have they got the cognitive ability to make sense of and understand what's going on for them right now? Is there an ability to understand the stimuli or the stressors in the environment? Secondly is manageability. So to what extent do they have the resources available to them right now to be able to cope with the demands of the environment that they're in? And if not, leading back into comprehensibility, do they have the ability to go out and search for those resources in order to proactively take control of that situation? And then finally, there's the manageability element within that as well. The meaningfulness element as well. So to what extent are they taking meaning and purpose, fulfillment from what it is that they're doing? To what extent is the activity that they're engaging in, if that's coaching, fulfilling and contributing towards their own sense of fulfillment and meaningfulness in the world?
I think even when you're talking there now, I'm flicking back to within grassroots coaching and that meaningfulness bit, working backwards from that. How does that play out for you then? Where I guess people I suppose we talked about a pressure in high performance sport about results and job security, and in grassroots sport it might be a pressure as in I need to keep doing this or nobody else will. So how would that then bounce there on the reverse?
Yeah, but what I've just described are sort of interacting rather than in isolation. So if we think about the meaningfulness component and this sense of purpose and let's call it duty around engaging in grassroots sports because nobody else will do it, when actually that can have a fairly negative impact because you're perhaps not taking cognizance of your own self-care in lieu of what I would describe as a fairly asymmetrical relationship with the club or the people that you work with. So you're giving more of yourself to them rather than investing time in your own self-care, and coaching, like other caring professions, is one of those roles in the system where it is quite asymmetrical. Athletes within the context of high performance environments or clubs can be quite selfish in terms of the demands that they place on coaches, not just in terms of their time, but in terms of everything else that goes into coaching from an emotional perspective, from a cognitive perspective, all that needs to go into it. So it's quite asymmetrical in that regard.
Thank you. And I suppose the last one from me before I hand back over to Michael, I think a lot of the time we throw around the term stress and burnout in respect of coaches, or now it's and at least increasingly those terms are starting to be talked about, which I suppose is a really good thing. Burnout, what is the difference between these two things, and one leads to the other, or tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, burnout is in essence experiencing chronic stress or an accumulation of stressors over time. Burnout first presents itself in I would say physical or emotional exhaustion. That seems to be the lead into the broader burnout experience, and burnout itself is the coexistence of that overwhelming sense of exhaustion coupled with a cynicism and an element of depersonalization as well. Pete, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, so the other thing is the other element of burnout is that reduced sense of personal accomplishment. So along with the exhaustion and the sort of cynicism towards the job, there's this idea that, or this feeling almost, that you're just treading water. Like, no matter how much effort you're still putting into the job, you're just not really achieving anything. You're not producing the work that you would like to work. So those three elements or those three things together are what the burnout syndrome is. And like Derek said, it's largely a response to chronic stress. But interestingly, there's a couple of other things that might feed into that burnout as well. So, you were talking earlier about doing the job because nobody else will. And Tom Radicke, a researcher from, I want to say America, but I think it's Canada, and I might get into trouble if I say one or the other. But he talked about commitment and the way that coaches are committed to the job. And there's two different types of commitment. So the first one is being attracted to the role. So high levels of benefits, few costs, doing it because you really enjoy it, doing it because you love it, versus this profile that he called entrapment, where you're almost kind of stuck in the coaching role. You don't really see the benefits of it anymore. The costs of it are quite high, but it's something that you've always done. There's a sort of social expectation for you to continue in that role, i.e., for example, if there's nobody else there to do it and it's something that you've done, you're kind of expected to continue. So having that type of profile where you almost feel like you're stuck in the job, coupled with ongoing stress, like that can really lead to burnout. Because not everybody who experiences stress experiences burnout. So there's other factors involved in there. I think intrinsic motivation has been linked with burnout as well. Again, the culture of the sport plays a role. So it's all of these things together. But stress really is the driving factor.
Yeah, just leading into that idea of identity, centrality in that as well. And we quite often see that current coaches in high-performance environments may have also previously been athletes in high-performance environments, and they were also athletes in pathway environments, and to some extent it's all they know. So their entire identity is contingent upon and wrapped up in this, identity within sport. And if one of the ways of dealing with burnout is walking away from the dysfunctional system that's making you, let's just say it's sick, then what impact is that going to have on the individual? And quite often that leads to that sense of entrapment. I've never known anything else, and therefore there's nowhere really for me to go. And I think that there was the other point I was going to make on that as well, that stress alone isn't necessarily a contributory factor to burnout. There's also some elements of personality traits as well, in particular trait anxiety, or we talk about imposter syndrome to some extent. So forms of maladaptive, self-evaluative perfectionism have been shown to contribute towards the burnout experience as well.
Great, thank you. I think that immediately, I suppose that's painting some challenges, and the questions that are jumping out to me now are, right, well, what can we do? And I know Michael's going to take us in that direction.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you've painted a lovely picture there of some of the stressors that exist, the negative capability of stress and how that might contribute to burnout. I suppose my question to you is, what can we do about that? What can we do to help foster a sense of well-being in our coaches out there across the pathway, right up from grassroots all the way to high performance?
You want me to kick this one off? I think first and foremost, before you get into any kind of intervention or work on promoting well-being, is to ask the question, what is well-being? Because that's going to be different, and it's going to be different for different people, and it's going to look different at different times of the year and different times of a competitive season. So understanding what well-being really means to somebody is kind of a fundamental precursor to actually working on it. But once you get to that stage, there's loads of different things that you can do. And I'll kind of pick up on what Derek was talking about there about identity. One of the ways of describing well-being is a negotiation almost between personal values and organizational values, or the values of the sport that you're working in. And it's understanding that those things are going to change over time, and at certain times some of your values are going to have are going to take priority, and some of them are going to fall by the wayside. So where identity comes into that is that, well, I have lots of values in different domains of life. I have values as a father. I have values as an academic. I have values as a husband. I have values as a son. All of these different areas of life. I have values about my health, and sometimes they're going to clash. Sometimes they're going to clash with, my values as a father and a husband are going to clash with my values as an academic. And that's okay. But a deep sort of exploration of, well, what are they? What am I willing to negotiate here? Like at certain times of the year, maybe I am going to have to spend a little bit of time away from my family to go to this work thing, or, work has to take priority for a couple of weeks. So my identity as an academic, as a researcher, it has to take priority. I can't do that all the time, but I can do that a little bit of the time. Whereas other times, my identity as a husband and a father is more important, and work has to take second fiddle. So understanding those different identities and the values that I associate with those different identities, and really exploring that is one of the perhaps broader things that we can start to look at in terms of well-being, and how can I negotiate what's more important, what takes priority at any given time.
Yeah, just to build on that, there was a lovely analogy with one of the coaches I did some research with around how world-class coaches cope with stress in the lead up to and throughout a competition. And one coach describes the equilibrium that he's trying to strike in the context of 3 balloons, one being his life, one being his coaching, and one being the things that make him him. And he talks about how he can't necessarily use all of the oxygen in his lungs to fill all 3 balloons equally. There are times where one's completely deflated while he's trying to keep the other 2 relatively well inflated. And I think that's the difficult balance I think that coaches try and strike sometimes, is without necessarily understanding that it's not always possible to find equilibrium. They try and be all things to all people and try and fulfill all obligations all of the time. And that in turn has a significantly negative experience or negative output on them in terms of their own well-being.
Yeah, and it's that phrase, isn't it? Work-life balance is a phrase that we often throw around, and it's a myth, isn't it? It's not about balance; it's about that equilibrium and that negotiation of values. Like it's constantly changing; it's constantly dynamic.
And whose responsibility is it to ensure coaches' well-being? Is it the coach themselves? Is it the club? Is it the organisation? Where does that responsibility lie?
I fundamentally believe that it is an organisational responsibility to put coach well-being high up on the agenda, because again, we're blaming the coach for their own ill-being or lack of well-being, because you haven't got the skills to manage this, you haven't gone on this mindfulness seminar, you haven't gone for your well-being Wednesday walk in the woods or whatever. So it's your fault that you're not dealing with all of this stress that we as the organisation are piling onto you. So I fundamentally believe it's an organisational responsibility. Having said that, there are things that coaches can do on an individual level, because at the end of the day, they still have to function in that environment. So I often talk about self-care as being a performance strategy, something that coaches can look at as, okay, well, this is a skill that's going to help me perform as a coach, rather than this kind of additional, it would be nice if we had time to do well-being stuff, but actually I've got more important things. No. This is something that's going to actually aid your performance. So there's the self-awareness stuff that we talked about a little bit earlier. There's self-compassion work as well. So understanding that actually most people are going through this. I'm going to treat myself with a little bit of kindness. I'm going to be aware of my own sort of responses to stress. So there's a self-compassion piece in there as well. As developing a sense of community with other coaches, either within or outside of the sport, because we know that perhaps there's some conflict of interest there when you're disclosing well-being. I mean, there shouldn't be, but there is. And then there's the coaches taking responsibility for perhaps changing the terms and conditions of their own jobs to build well-being into their job descriptions. And that doesn't have to be huge things. That could be like the tiniest little things. It could be taking like the tiniest little breaks. Can I have 5 minutes in my day that is just for me? Like 5 minutes. And you'd be surprised how much adding all of those little things up, like how much difference that can actually make. So yes, it's an organizational responsibility, but that doesn't mean that there aren't things that coaches can do to look after their own well-being a little bit as well.
Yeah. And look, leaning back into the literature a wee bit, I think as early as 1992, Veely was starting to make recommendations around what systems can do to support the well-being of coaches, and some of the stuff that sits within there is around policy development to promote coach well-being, practitioners embedded within the system to support and manage their well-being, supporting coaches to develop psychological skills and personal resources to cope, and the role of coach education in developing self-awareness, self-regulation, and perhaps some emotional regulation as well in response to stress. But you know, that's literature that's 31 years old, but we're still not necessarily seeing that translate into what coach education and coach development programs look like. We're starting to see the emergence of these things, but when we think about the buckets that we have in the context of our work, sometimes coach well-being sits in the too difficult to deal with bucket, because it's a topic that's so sensitive that people tend to step back from rather than lean into when it's perhaps a topic giving, as Peter alluded to, the context of the world that we live in just now. It's probably more important than ever to try and pay some attention to not just coach well-being, but well-being in general in the context of the sporting system.
And earlier in the conversation, we talked about culturally, we're probably not there yet in terms of actually putting coach well-being at the forefront of our priorities. If I was a club or a governing body or a sporting organisation or anyone who deploys a coach, what's your sell to ensure that they put that to the forefront? So what would you say? So if I'm someone in one of those organisations, what would you say to me? Why should I put coach well-being at the forefront of my priorities?
It will improve your performance. Bottom line. Because, you know, again, high performance sport or kind of any sport, we can't get, as much as it would be lovely to, we can't get away from the fact that performance is the bottom line. Your funding depends on it. Your job depends on it. You have to perform. That's the nature of the beast. So why is well-being important? Because it will improve your performance. It will improve the relationships that your coach has with your athletes. It will improve your coach's ability to manage some of those stresses of the environment. It will improve their performance. It will improve the athlete's performance. It will improve the clubs, the teams, the sports, the organisation's performance. Bottom line.
I'm sold. You got me.
Yeah, me too.
Grand. So we're getting towards the back end now, guys. One of the things that has jumped out to me a little bit is, and I know everybody's home situation different, all individuals are different, but spoke about, you know, those balloons being inflated and deflated, and one of the things that came up for me while you were talking about that was, well, how important is it that we help whoever our home team, if you like, our family or the people around us at home understand that, so that is it sort of bringing them into our thinking and helping them to support us, if you like. So how important is that, and how can we do that? And have you seen that be a really important thing for coaches in the past?
You're looking at me now. So I think what you're getting at is the communication of needs. And I've got a really good example of this. So I used to sit in my office and I used to put my headphones on. And for me, putting my headphones on was like, don't talk to me. Leave me alone. I'm busy. Right? For everybody else, like, they didn't realize that. So people would come and like knock on the door or like tap me on the shoulder. Pete, can you just do this? Pete, can you just do that? Can you look at this for me? And I'm sitting there getting more and more annoyed and more frustrated because I can't get on with what I need to get on with. But what hadn't occurred to me is that I hadn't actually told anyone that, okay, when I put my headphones on, like, can you just leave me alone for a little bit? So I hadn't communicated that need to the people around me, and that left me feeling frustrated and annoyed and irritated because I wasn't getting what I needed. So I think what you're talking about there is exactly that. It's, well, here's what I need at the moment from you as a family, you as an organization, you as my athletes. And it's one thing knowing those things, but actually being able to communicate those things to other people is the step that we often miss out, and that just leads to our own frustration. So yeah, the communication of those needs, identification of them first of all, but then communicating them to the people who are important is massively, massively important. Yeah.
Yeah, and again, maybe back into the self-awareness piece that Pete was talking about earlier on. I described a quote around a coach in the lead up to a competition. He described himself as getting a worse father but a better coach in the lead up to a games. And it is around that self-awareness piece, back to what Pete was talking about as well, in terms of, well, have my responses to the same stressors changed? Well, what does that say about me, and how do I then negotiate that with my family? Back into the comprehensibility element, do I have the emotional literacy to describe how I'm feeling and have open and honest conversations, not just with my family, but what does the organisation do to be able to foster those types of conversations within organisations? So do we celebrate, reward and reinforce the fact that it's okay to show signs of vulnerability and see that as a real strength rather than a weakness? And we talked about the very sort of patriarchal nature of sport and how we privilege masculine behaviour. So we don't necessarily often celebrate people who are open. We like stoicism. We like people who show strength. And as Pete alluded to and what he described in his previous research around this superhero complex, well, actually, if we show more vulnerability, not just in the context of our work, but equally more vulnerability at home. And look, I've been a coach and I know that I've been shut off to my family at times because of what I'm making sense of. Let people in. It's perfectly okay to do so, because the greatest sense of support that you're going to have is that sort of social network that you've got around you, who aren't going to be judgmental, who aren't going to judge or criticize you for what you're saying. They'll take on some of the burden unconditionally. And I think sometimes coaches don't necessarily recognize that. And if we go back into some of the profiles of high performance coaches, some of them are on their second marriage. Some of them are quite, overweight. Some of them aren't very good around taking positive health behaviors in terms of exercise and diet. They're not very good at taking care of themselves. And the wider impact, not just on themselves, but the people around them, is significant. So for me, it's just a case of showing vulnerability and being open to and welcoming the help as it's available to you.
Yeah, I think I really like that, because I suppose lots of the things that we're talking about here are, there's some things that we can do ourselves, and there's some things that the stressors are coming from third parties, but that, I guess, is down to us, isn't it? Yeah. Okay. So I guess as we come to the end here, what we are always conscious of is that we've got some questions that we've worked through, and then we're speaking to two people here who might have more to say about something in particular. So is there anything that we haven't discussed so far that you guys think should be really important to get that across in connection with this topic?
I guess for me, we just lean back into the system stuff again, and what's the role of the system in providing meaningful resources and support to help the development, to maintain a sense of well-being for coaches. Meaningful resources like access to healthcare services as and when they need it. So we talked earlier on today around our ideation of health being the absence of disease, disability, or early mortality, and actually could we take more of a health promotion view of the world, where we provide adequate resources to coaches in terms of their health, provide appropriate education and training, and as I said before, fostering an open culture where showing vulnerability is safe, celebrated, reinforced and rewarded without fear of judgment in terms of their roles. Pete talked earlier on around perhaps upward pressure, and in the context of the high performance environment, there's always somebody else ready to take your role, and to take that fear away from people by fostering that open culture, I think will lead to a greater sense of vulnerability for coaches, that they can reach out and seek the help that they need without the fear of perhaps losing their job or being viewed or perceived as broken within the system, when sometimes the system is the thing that's broken and not necessarily the people within it.
Yeah, I mean, I would just echo what Derek said. Really, it's a fairly large scale cultural shift that's needed, and that's always going to be a challenge when you're in an environment like high performance sport, where again, you know, the bottom line is winning. It just is. So it's how can you, or the challenge really is, how can you shift that culture to one of more openness and vulnerability, while still acknowledging that yes, it's a high performance environment, and yes, it's going to be stressful, and yes, all of these things are going to exist. That's the challenge. Right? We're not trying to say it shouldn't be stressful. We're not trying to say it shouldn't be stressful and that everyone should just come and have a nice time. And, you know, like we're not saying that. We're saying, how can you keep that competitive, like, nature of the beast, yet still shift that culture to one where vulnerability and openness and talking about mental health and mental well-being is just normalized. That's the challenge.
Yeah, and just to close on that, you know, having healthy systems, which house healthy environments, which has healthy people, including healthy coaches and healthy athletes in, can only offer you some form of competitive advantage in the long run. And therefore there is a performance benefit to really investing in well-being.
Brilliant. I think that's a great place to leave it. Michael, hand back to you.
Yeah, guys, that was fantastic, and that really your last point there really resonated with me, because I firmly believe that the two are not exclusive. I think we can have a healthy environment where everyone feels healthy in that space, absolutely, including the coaches. But we can also still be competitive. We can also try and, you know, as you say, Pete, you know, high performance sport is about winning. Can we do both at the same time? Yeah, we can, absolutely can. If the structures are right and the systems are right and the priorities are right for those who make decisions. So absolutely with you on that one. It's been fantastic having the conversation here with you guys. Obviously a lot of knowledge, a lot of depth of experience here. It's been brilliant, considering something which certainly Simon and myself, when we've talked about it, we see it as a real priority as well.
Definitely. Thanks very much, guys. Thank you.
Thank you.
Curious Coaching is brought to you by Sport Northern Ireland. We hope that this episode has sparked some curiosity for you and your coaching. The future belongs to the curious.